What if a family's wealth was built not on luck but on cruelty, secrets, and blood? What if behind the velvet curtains and marble halls of high society lurked something so twisted, so fundamentally wrong, that even time itself couldn't wash away the stain? Tonight we delve into the story of the Fletcher family, a name that once commanded respect across 3 states, whispered in drawing rooms and feared in back alleys. For over a century they held power that seemed to defy explanation. But power built on darkness has a way of consuming those who wield it. Before we begin this descent into one of history's most disturbing family secrets, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell. You won't want to miss what we uncover about the families that shaped our world from the shadows. The Fletcher story begins in the autumn of 1847, when Nathaniel Fletcher arrived in the growing industrial town of Millbrook with nothing but a worn leather satchel and eyes that seemed to hold secrets. Within 5 years, this mysterious stranger had become the town's most influential businessman. Within 10, he owned half the factories, the largest bank, and enough political connections to bend the town to his will. But Nathaniel's rise wasn't built on innovation or hard work. Those who remembered the early days spoke in hushed tones about rival businessmen who'd challenged Fletcher, only to find their warehouses mysteriously catching fire, their workers suddenly refusing to show up, their own families plagued by a string of unfortunate accidents. When Marcus Thornberry, the town's previous banking magnate, publicly accused Fletcher of fraud, he was found dead in his study 3 days later. The official cause was suicide, but those close to Thornberry knew he'd never shown a hint of despair. As Fletcher's empire grew, so did the whispers. Competitors didn't just lose business, they disappeared entirely. Families who'd lived in Millbrook for generations would pack up overnight, claiming urgent business elsewhere. Those brave enough to stay spoke of strange dreams of feeling watched, of children who wouldn't play near the Fletcher properties after dark. Nathaniel understood that true power required more than money. It demanded fear, respect, and most importantly, legacy. He married Virginia Blackwood, daughter of a declining aristocratic family in what appeared to be a union of convenience. But those who attended the wedding ceremony would later recall Virginia's trembling hands, her hollow eyes, and the way she seemed to shrink whenever her new husband looked at her. The Fletcher mansion rose from Millbrook's highest hill like a Gothic monument to ambition, 7 stories of black stone and twisted iron, with windows that caught light in unsettling ways. The architecture seemed designed not for comfort, but for intimidation. Tall, narrow hallways that swallowed sound, rooms with too many shadows, and a foundation that ran deeper underground than any mansion should need. Local contractors whispered about the construction. They spoke of chambers built beneath the mansion's foundation, accessible only through hidden passages. Workers reported finding strange symbols carved into support beams, and several men refused to return after hearing unexplained sounds echoing through the walls. One foreman claimed he'd seen Nathaniel Fletcher standing in the basement at midnight, surrounded by men in dark coats, conducting what looked like a ritual around an ornate table. Inside these imposing walls, the Fletcher children grew up under rules that would seem alien to any normal family. Affection was weakness, questions were defiance, emotion was failure. The 5 Fletcher children, 3 boys and 2 girls, learned early that their father's love came with conditions, and his disappointment came with consequences far worse than any typical punishment. Servants who worked in the mansion during those early years would later describe a household ruled by cold precision. Meals taken in absolute silence, children who moved through the halls like ghosts, always walking in straight lines, never running, never laughing. The eldest son, Marcus, bore scars on his hands that looked suspiciously like deliberate burns. The youngest daughter, Constance, developed a stutter that only appeared when her father was present. Neighbors began noticing disturbing patterns. Fletcher children were sometimes seen wandering the mansion grounds at midnight, still dressed in their day clothes, moving with the mechanical precision of sleepwalkers. During family gatherings, rare public appearances meant to maintain their social standing, the Fletcher family would sit together in perfect silence, each member's face an emotionless mask. Mrs. Henderson, who cleaned houses for several wealthy families, worked briefly for the Fletchers before quitting without notice. Years later, she would tell her daughter about finding children's drawings hidden beneath mattresses, sketches of dark figures, underground rooms, and ceremonies involving hooded men. She spoke of discovering implements in the basement that had no apparent household purpose, tools that seemed designed for purposes she couldn't or wouldn't identify. But it was the servants' quarters where the real whispers began. Maids spoke of being summoned to the mansion's lower levels at strange hours, asked to clean rooms that showed signs of activities they couldn't quite comprehend. They described finding stains that required multiple attempts to remove, discovering personal belongings that didn't belong to any family member, and hearing sounds from behind locked doors that suggested the presence of people who weren't supposed to be there. As the Fletcher children grew into adulthood, the family's reputation took on an almost supernatural quality. Local folklore began treating them not as wealthy eccentrics, but as something darker. A family touched by forces that normal people shouldn't meddle with. Every generation of Fletchers seemed plagued by the same pattern: early promise followed by madness, mysterious illnesses that doctors couldn't diagnose, and deaths that occurred at moments when they might have revealed family secrets. The pattern was too consistent to ignore. Nathaniel's brother died in a hunting accident just weeks after expressing concerns about the family business. The eldest Fletcher daughter married into Boston society, only to die of sudden heart failure at age 28, the same day her husband discovered documents suggesting illegal activities. Even those who married into the Fletcher family seemed to inherit the curse, developing strange behaviors, suffering unexplained ailments, or simply vanishing from social circles altogether. Dr. Emmett Carling, the town's physician, kept private notes about his Fletcher family patients. These records, discovered decades later, painted a disturbing picture. He documented recurring nightmares among family members, described injuries that appeared to be self-inflicted, and noted behavioral changes that suggested severe psychological trauma. Most unsettling were his observations about the children. He described them as displaying an unusual understanding of pain and reactions to stress that suggest familiarity with situations no child should encounter. Local churches reported that no Fletcher had attended services regularly for over 30 years. When pressed, family members would cite scheduling conflicts or health concerns, but church records showed a pattern of donations that seemed designed to buy silence rather than seek spiritual guidance. Father McKenna, who served Millbrook's Catholic parish for over 40 years, once confided to his successor that he'd received several late-night visits from Fletcher family members, visits where they spoke not of confession, but of absolution for acts they claimed were necessary for family survival. The curse, if that's what it was, seemed to intensify with each passing generation. The second generation of Fletchers produced 7 children, but only 3 lived to see their 30th birthday. The survivors showed signs of psychological instability that became impossible to hide. James Fletcher, Nathaniel's grandson, was institutionalized after being found in the town square at dawn, covered in someone else's blood and claiming to have no memory of the previous evening. The investigation was quietly dropped after substantial donations appeared in the sheriff's personal accounts. Rebecca Fletcher, the family's most promising member, had been educated in Europe and seemed poised to bring respectability back to the family name. She returned to Millbrook with plans to modernize the family business and distance herself from her grandfather's methods. Within 6 months of her return, neighbors reported seeing lights in the mansion's basement at all hours, hearing sounds that suggested construction or renovation work. Rebecca's letters to European friends stopped abruptly, and when concerned acquaintances visited, they found her dramatically changed, hollow-eyed, nervous, and speaking in fragmented sentences about family obligations and prices that must be paid. The turning point came in 1923, when Thomas Fletcher, the family's last legitimate heir, tried to break the cycle that had consumed his family for 3 generations. Thomas had been educated away from Millbrook, raised partially by relatives who'd managed to escape the family's influence. He returned with modern ideas about business ethics and a determination to expose and end whatever practices had given his family their power. His investigation into the family's financial records revealed connections to organizations that shouldn't have existed, payments to individuals who had no apparent identity, and property holdings that included locations no legitimate business would need. Thomas discovered evidence suggesting that his great-grandfather Nathaniel hadn't just built a business empire. He'd created a network that controlled aspects of several states' political and economic systems through methods that went far beyond simple corruption. When Thomas attempted to go public with his discoveries, the response was swift and devastating. His wife received anonymous threats that described their children's daily routines in disturbing detail. His business partners suddenly terminated contracts without explanation. Bank accounts that had been stable for decades showed unexplained withdrawals and transfers. Most unnervingly, Thomas began receiving visits from elderly men who claimed to have worked with his great-grandfather, men who spoke about debts that passed from generation to generation, and obligations that couldn't be dissolved simply by wanting to be free. Local newspapers initially showed interest in Thomas's story, but editors who'd agreed to investigate suddenly canceled meetings, claiming concerns about libel laws. The Millbrook Herald's owner, who'd publicly criticized the Fletcher family for years, published a retraction of previous stories and announced a new policy of not reporting on unsubstantiated rumors about respected community members. But Thomas's most disturbing discovery came from documents hidden in the mansion's foundation, papers that suggested the Fletcher family's power wasn't just based on intimidation and violence, but on agreements that involved people and organizations that operated completely outside normal society. These documents referenced rituals, schedules that corresponded to lunar cycles, and gatherings that required specific types of participants. The language was deliberately obscure, but Thomas understood enough to realize that his family's success had been purchased with a currency that went far beyond money. When Thomas tried to destroy these documents, he discovered they were somehow protected. Attempts to burn them failed repeatedly, and when he tried to have them professionally destroyed, the documents would mysteriously reappear in their original location. It was then that Thomas realized his family hadn't just made a bargain with dark forces, they'd become part of something that wouldn't allow them to simply walk away. The final confrontation came on a winter night in 1924. Thomas had gathered enough evidence to expose not just his family, but the network of individuals and organizations that had enabled their power for over 70 years. He'd arranged to meet with federal investigators, planned to turn over documents that would destroy the Fletcher legacy forever. He was found the next morning in the mansion's basement, surrounded by burned papers and showing signs of a struggle that must have lasted hours. The official cause of death was a heart attack brought on by smoke inhalation, but those who saw the scene before authorities arrived described evidence of a confrontation involving multiple people, as well as signs that suggested the basement had been used for purposes that went far beyond storage. Thomas's wife and children disappeared the same night. Their belongings remained in the mansion untouched, but they simply vanished without leaving any trace. Local authorities conducted a brief investigation, but witnesses who might have provided information either claimed to have seen nothing or suddenly left town for unexplained reasons. With Thomas's death, the Fletcher family's public presence crumbled almost overnight. The business empire that had controlled Millbrook for 3 generations collapsed within months. Properties were sold to anonymous buyers. Bank accounts were emptied by individuals with legal authority that couldn't be traced. And employees of Fletcher Enterprises found themselves working for companies they'd never heard of. The mansion stood empty for over a decade, its windows dark and its grounds returning to wilderness. Local children dared each other to approach the building, but none ever made it past the front gate, not because of any physical barrier, but because of an overwhelming sense of wrongness that seemed to emanate from the structure itself. During those empty years, Millbrook residents reported strange occurrences that seemed connected to the abandoned Fletcher property. Lights would appear in the mansion's windows on nights when no one should have been inside. People walking past the estate would hear sounds, voices, machinery, activity that suggested ongoing habitation. Most disturbing were the reports of figures seen moving through the mansion's grounds, individuals who appeared to be conducting the same type of midnight activities that had characterized the Fletcher family's most secretive periods. In 1936, the last surviving Fletcher family member, Constance Fletcher Morrison, returned to Millbrook. She'd been living under her married name in California, working as a seamstress and apparently trying to build a life completely disconnected from her family's legacy. But something drew her back. She spoke to neighbors about dreams that commanded her return, about obligations that couldn't be ignored regardless of distance or time. Constance spent 3 months in the mansion, apparently trying to understand and end whatever forces had controlled her family for nearly a century. Neighbors reported seeing lights throughout the building, hearing sounds that suggested she was not alone, and observing visitors who came to the mansion only at night and left before dawn. Her final letter, found after her disappearance, provided the clearest explanation anyone would ever receive about the Fletcher family's true nature. She wrote about discovering that her great-grandfather hadn't simply made a bargain for power. He'd become part of something that required periodic renewal, something that demanded specific types of service from each generation. She described finding evidence that the Fletcher family had been, essentially, caretakers for activities that served purposes she couldn't fully comprehend, but that clearly extended far beyond their small town. Constance's letter ended with a warning. The Fletcher family's disappearance wouldn't end their obligations. The network that had given them power would simply transfer those responsibilities to others, continuing cycles that had been operating long before the Fletchers arrived in Millbrook, and would continue long after their name was forgotten. She was found 3 days later in the mansion's basement, in the same room where Thomas had died 12 years earlier. Unlike previous Fletcher deaths, however, Constance's showed no signs of struggle or violence. She appeared to have simply laid down and stopped living, as if the act of understanding her family's true situation had drained her of any will to continue fighting. With Constance's death, the Fletcher mansion was finally abandoned for good. The building deteriorated rapidly, as if the forces that had maintained it were no longer present. Within 5 years, the structure was unsafe for entry. Within 10, it had collapsed entirely, leaving only a foundation that local authorities filled with concrete and declared permanently off-limits. But even today, nearly a century after the Fletcher family's final disappearance, Millbrook residents report occurrences that suggest their story isn't truly finished. Construction workers refuse to build on certain parcels of land, claiming that equipment malfunctions and workers experience unexplained health problems on specific sites. Local historians have documented families who moved to Millbrook and gradually developed the same patterns of behavior that characterized the Fletcher family: increasing wealth accompanied by social isolation, mysterious business practices, and children who seemed older and more serious than their years should allow. Most unsettling are the reports from genealogists and researchers who've tried to investigate the Fletcher family's complete history. Several have abandoned their research after discovering connections to organizations and individuals that seem to exist outside normal historical records. Others have reported being contacted by representatives of groups that claim authority over information about the Fletcher family, groups that seem to possess detailed knowledge about the researchers' personal lives and professional activities. So what were the Fletchers, victims of their own cruelty, or servants of something far more sinister? Were they a family that gained power through violence and intimidation, only to have their methods consume them? Or were they part of something larger, something that continues to operate through other families in other places? The truth may be more disturbing than either explanation. Perhaps the Fletcher family represents something that exists in the spaces between normal society, networks of power that operate according to rules most people never encounter, systems that require periodic renewal through families willing to serve purposes they may never fully understand. What do you believe, curse, crime, or something far worse? The Fletcher family's story ended almost a century ago, but the forces that shaped their rise and fall may still be at work today, operating through different names in different places, maintaining the same cycles of power and darkness that consumed one family's legacy, in a small town that still refuses to speak their name aloud. Subscribe to uncover more stories about the families that shaped our world from the shadows, and let me know in the comments. What do you think really happened to the Fletchers? Some secrets are too dark to stay buried forever.